What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? There have been several confirmed cases in a few different countries of people living in other people's houses unbeknownst to them. I believe one case went on for a couple of years. The intruder would wait until the homeowner would go to work and then sneak out and steal small amounts of food as not to be noticed. Well, eventually the homeowner did notice and couldn't figure out where his food was going, so he set up a hidden camera to record it. I can only imagine how scary it would have been to come home from work one night and sit down to watch the video, skipping through hours of stillness, to suddenly come across a person crawling out of your attic, and then the slow realization that that person is still in your house at that moment, and then the retroactive fear of thinking back to all the times you laid awake at night and heard a noise, which you just dismissed as coming from the pipes or the old wooden beams, but actually it was a terrifying person just above you. It gives me the heebie-jeebies every time I think about it. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us had done. One of his friends told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened. And afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. Lived W3 other girls sophomore year of college. All three took off early for spring break, leaving me alone in the house. First night alone, I heard someone bang on my front door at 2 AM. Then I hear more knocks at the back door. A man yells, "Boulder police, open the door." When I didn't, I heard body slams against both doors. Soon I hear, "Little girl, open the door. We know you're alone." At this point I'm so scared I keep accidentally dialing 611 instead of 911. When I eventually do get the police, cars roll up. Thankfully, just minutes later, officers have 4 boys from our school hockey team face down on the grass. I had to file restraining orders against them, and the kicker, one lived across the street from me and we'd never spoken a single word before then. When I worked in healthcare I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst. Amazingly, he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Take your full dose of antibiotics, people. When I was about 8 years old our school was doing swimming lessons as part of the curriculum. My mum worked late, so we went to after school care and didn't get home until after dark. When we got home mum asked me to take my wet togs, bathing suit, and towel out to the clothesline to dry so I could use them the next day. I was so confident going outside to do this and had this real feeling of being a big kid. I walked into our backyard only for a man to be running at me. I screamed, jumped inside and instinctively locked the back door as I did so. As this was happening, my mum told me she heard the guy jump the gate which was next to her bedroom just after she heard me scream and came running to find me. I slept with the light on until I was 16 and I get my husband to go outside for me while it's dark. One of my friends was drugged by a nice seeming girl at a bar that tried to sex traffic her. The girl got her an Uber to an address she didn't know under the guise of "get my drunk friend home," but she woke up on the way and told the driver she didn't know where they were going. They called the cops. Apparently that wasn't the first time that week they'd heard the same story and they recognized the address as one they were already tracking. If she hadn't woken up on the way she might have been trafficked by now. Apparently they use younger, safe seeming girls to do the collecting a lot of the time. And to those of you who asked, this was in the US, in Washington state a few years ago. We don't know who tried to do it. The bar was informed. To the people telling me this didn't happen or is made up, I'm just relaying what she told me after it happened. I don't have any reason to believe she was lying about it, nor do I have anything to gain, and it'd be pretty effed up to make up something like this. One of my dad's friend's wife was murdered by some crazy dude walking down the street. This guy had just been released from a mental hospital and literally just stabbed her as she walked home. When my dad's friend came back, he thought she had just taken the dogs out for a walk, so he walked along the normal walk route and he saw loads of blue lights. He was stopped by a police officer and wasn't allowed any closer until he saw that it was his wife. The Lake Bodom murders are very scary. Like, there are 4 teens who go on a camping trip in Finland. The next morning, 3 of the teens are found murdered, and one of them is almost dead and severely injured, but survived. No one knows who the murderer is today. 44 years later, the 4th teen, Nils, who survived, was accused of murdering them and gets sent to prison. But then he was released a year later, because there was little DNA evidence to prove this, and no good evidence to prove that he murdered them at all. However, there is circumstantial evidence such as he allegedly fought his one friend due to an argument and was drunk. Some say this could have ended in accidental and or intentional murder. However, I personally highly doubt that Nils is guilty. I couldn't find much information on who Nils thought the murderer was, so my thoughts are 1. It's too traumatic for him to remember, or 2. He didn't recognize the person. Some other key suspects include the manager of the camp, who was known for being quite hostile, an ice cream vendor who admitted to the crime on his deathbed, and a man who lived only a short distance from the camp who claimed to be in Germany during that time. However, there is much doubt for his claim. There was a sketch released of the alleged murderer, who seems to be an unsettling picture of an older man, and you can find a photo of the man, who looks like the guy in the sketch, attending a police speech. When I was a little girl 9 years old or thereabouts, I was playing at the school down the street from my house. It was the middle of summer and myself and a girlfriend were hanging around watching the boys play street hockey. One of the boys called my name and said a man in the parking lot was looking for me. The parking lot was mostly obscured by the building, but I could see an old 70s style van that hadn't been there earlier. I was walking over to the van when the mother of one of the other kids showed up looking for her son and asked me what I was doing. When I told her someone in the van was looking for me, she took my hand and started to walk with me, and the van pulled out and sped away. Friend's mom walked me home and I wasn't allowed out of my yard without my parents for the rest of the summer. I was so upset and didn't understand why I was being punished. It was only years later that I understood that I was likely being targeted by some opportunistic scumbag for who knows what. Thanks MRS. Gibson, wherever you are. And for people asking, my parents didn't say they were punishing me. They just kept me close to the house, so I assumed that I was being punished. I lived in a very small, safe, we don't lock our doors town. Kids roamed the streets from sunup until sundown, typically playing in the old quarries and on railway tracks and on gigantic limestone hills and all kinds of we'd never let our kids do now. A few people were worried about MRS. Gisbin's son, he was fine. We all were. She had come in from the other entrance to the schoolyard behind us, whereas the boys were closer to the parking lot. I barely got within shouting distance of the van before it sped off. Most kids are unfortunately abducted by people they know, so I have no way of knowing if it was some creep who knew me from all the activities my parents had us in, or just some opportunist guy who said to the boy, "You know that girl over there? Can you call her over for me?" We were all taught about stranger danger. Shout out to Canadians who remember, stay alert, stay safe, and because MRS. Gibson showed up, I'll never know if those lessons sunk in or not. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s. During her first semester at college, they were lab partners, and mom thought he seemed cute and nice, and was too shy at the time to ask him out, but she said if he'd asked her out, she would have went. They were friendly with each other in class, but their paths didn't cross outside of that since they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other classes, the library, the student union, out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule. My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule, and the secretary blew it off because you guys are dating. Luckily, mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year, and spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that, but it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school. Mom was at work, and grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform, and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, she let the man in. Because he looked rather sad, he starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss, which completely mystified grandma. Well, mom, I just got back from overseas, and I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her. My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment, let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset, and my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide, but he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you would need a ladder to get to, and his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing, and this didn't win him too many friends, so it's anyone's guess who he might have pissed off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly, like, yeah, back in those days, they didn't really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. Not the scariest one I've heard, but one of the scariest things to happen to me. Also in my post history in our Let's Not Meet. A few years ago I was living in a big city. Didn't know anyone. A guy I was seeing came from abroad to visit me. At the end of his trip I accompanied him to his train home. After that I went back into the metro to go home. It was about 2 p.m. Very bright and sunny outside. I sat down on a bench near a man. We made eye contact and I said hello. He said hello back. I felt like something was off but tried to ignore it. The metro car came and we both got inside. It was crowded. I took a seat. He took one of the only available ones, which was right across from me. I started thinking I was overreacting since he started talking to a man near me. Seemed like they knew each other. His friend got off after a few stops but he stayed. Once I saw my own stop approaching to change lines I got up. He got up too and was right behind me. I could see his reflection in the metro car window and he was very slowly looking my legs up and down. I started to feel very uneasy. The doors open. We get off. I start walking quickly to the end of the platform, then realize he might be following me. There were several exits around, so I suddenly changed direction to go to another exit. He changed course as well. Then I turned around again. He followed. I did this a few times and he changed his path to match mine each time. Eventually I knew I had to leave somehow so he wouldn't catch up, so I went to the exit I needed to take to change lines and go home. Unfortunately the passageway to the next line was flooded with people, so I was slowed down. He caught up with me and started crowding me in, getting closer and closer to me. I was backed up against a wall at this point. Him just smiling brightly at me. "Hello, how are you?" he asked me, still inching towards me. I was terrified at this point. No one stopped to even glance at us, so I knew unless I did something myself I wouldn't get away from him. I glanced to the right and saw a staircase downwards. Without warning I sprinted away to the stairs. He was very caught off guard and it took him 2 or 3 seconds to start following me. I flew down the stairs and straight into a metro car. I turned around to see if he was close behind. He was sprinting down the stairs as well. Thankfully, the doors closed before he could get to the bottom and we pulled away. Surprisingly, I had gotten onto the right metro line and direction to go home. Not that it mattered much to me at the time. That incident and several others of men following me home or in the street make me paranoid when I walk outside alone. My friends and I were drinking one night and going around asking, hey, whatever happened to, in this case, a guy a few of us used to have an aid period with in high school. Nice kid. Googled him. I found a few sad results playing this game in the past, and there were a couple appellate court decisions visible in first few results. Turns out he went to Afghanistan, got extremely fed up in combat, Court notes said he saw things there that completely ended him, basically, and came home with PTSD and delusional schizophrenia. Once home, he apparently has been on a mission to kill his mother to save her from demons and send her to heaven. He's tried and failed numerous times. Apparently, it's not just that ab plot though, it's all this around. We looked up his social media accounts then and it's just threads and threads of manic rambling about demons. It was sad to find this, and not the only time I found a former classmate lost her mind, unfortunately, but also terrifying to think you could be normal, then through one set of circumstances or another, become completely insane within a few years.